Good afternoon, everybody. Um, as you probably know, Andrew and I are going to be going through ChatGPT today. So you may or may not have heard about it in the last 4 months if you've been on the internet at all. It's a pretty cool piece of technology that hopefully, whether or not you're a developer or in marketing or sales or pretty much anything, you should be able to utilize this to at least some extent. And today we're going to kind of take you through what it is, what you should use it for, and a few other things as well. So, just kind of what we're going to go through. First, we're going to go through what ChatGPT is. Is it an NBA player? Maybe. I don't know. Then we're going to ask the all important question of whether or not Terminators are going to take over the world because this is artificial intelligence. And then go over why you should use ChatGPT. And then go over why you should not use ChatGPT. And then finally, we're going to round it out with some use case examples, kind of going across the board between programming, general use, and just some miscellaneous examples. So to start it all off, the question of what is ChatGPT? So I just copied this straight from Wikipedia. So if you want to read the whole thing, feel free. But essentially, what it is it's just a human language uh, AI model. So all it's really doing is trying to predict the next word. So whatever prompt that you give it, it's trying to predict the next word in that sequence. And it does that through all of these different layers, which is kind of what this graph over on the right is. Now, this might look complicated. And for some of you in this meeting, you might be asking the question, well, is this the rise of the machines? Is Skynet going to take over tomorrow because AI is now taking over the world? So let's kind of dive into that. So there are two types of AI or artificial intelligence. The first kind is what's called artificial narrow intelligence. So artificial narrow intelligence is where a machine can perform a singular task within a specific domain, and it can perform that task very well. Oftentimes better than a human, but it is restricted to that specific domain, and it's not really thinking more as much as it's just responding to a set of inputs and giving you an output. Um, and also, specifically, the knowledge that it has does not transfer to a different domain. So, the two examples that I have here is some of you might have heard in 2017, Google's child company DeepMind created a artificial narrow intelligence program called AlphaGo, which successfully beat the world Go master in a game of Go, which for many years people thought was impossible. And then more recently, just last year, the same company, DeepMind, produced a narrow artificial intelligence that successfully predicted protein folding in the worlds of biomedical engineering. So these two examples, obviously, they're both artificial intelligence, but you can see just between the two of these that AlphaGo is not going to be able to do protein folding. AlphaFold is not going to be able to play a game of Go. So they're restricted to a specific domain. They're really only good at doing one specific thing. The second type of AI is probably what most of you are thinking of when you think of AI. This is called artificial general intelligence. So, artificial general intelligence is where an AI can perform human actions. It can self learn and reason within its own environment. It can learn from very few examples or from unstructured data, and it can leverage that knowledge between different domains. So a great example of this is if anybody has played the game Halo, you will know that Cortana in Halo is an artificial intelligence program, and obviously Skynet, which is the infamous AI that takes over the world and kind of starts a war between the humans and the machines in Terminator. It's also what people talk about when they talk about the AI singularity, if you've heard that term kind of thrown around. So now that we know that what that is, where does ChatGPT fall on the band of narrow AI to general AI? It falls right about there. It's really only good for the specific domain that it's in. It's only going to do exactly what you tell it to do. And even when you tell it exactly what to do, a lot of times it's not going to do what you tell it to do, as we will demonstrate in some examples. So going into a little bit more in depth of what AI is. So AI or machine learning is essentially just math. It's a series of inputs and outputs that runs some basic math, I guess if you want to call it that, It's a combination of calculus and linear algebra for those who have taken those courses. If you remember in your calculus class, when you had to find the minimum of a function, so right down here in the bottom, finding the minimum, that's essentially what an machine learning algorithm is doing, except instead of in 2 dimensions, it's doing it in 2 million dimensions. Um, so if you want to know more, we'll link this presentation after this. I have a couple videos here. There's a really good theoretical overview of how this works, and then there's also a practical application of how you can code this up in Python. So if you want to know more, you can take a look at those. And the all important question, is AI going to take your job? Uh, yes and no. So as a AI as a tool will not, but those who leverage it will. And what do I mean by that is it's kind of going to be an adapt or die situation because the people who know how to use this and know how to leverage it are going to sprint past you very fast. And if you don't use it, you're kind of just cutting your own foot off. And are not going to be able to compete in the world going forward. So learn to use it, learn how to use it well, learn what its disadvantages are so that you can be prepared when this really starts to take off.
So within our world, it's all about identifying when is it appropriate to use this tool as compared to any other tool. So to start off the argument for, the for side of why should you use this, why would you care about this? Got a few prompts there. Do you still enjoy using paper maps? Do you like repetitive tasks that are mind-numbing and endless but have to be done in order for a project to get completed? Do you enjoy sorting through hundreds of entries when you're trying to figure something out? If you're like me and all of those made your stomach turn, then that is why we're giving this presentation. ChatGPT, its best use within our world is as an efficiency tool, as a way to reduce the time it takes you to execute certain things and to make it more accessible to access new information that you didn't have before, and to just simplify um, tasks that we already have to do. So the kind of questions for when you're thinking about when should you use this as opposed to going through any other process that's already in your day-to-day is there a way this can make my life easier, make my work more efficient, um, you know, make something better that I otherwise wouldn't be able to do without the use of this kind of a tool. So to summarize some of the benefits of it, as I mentioned, time saving, the ability to generate utilities and execute simple tasks with specific scope very quickly, discover new things that you hadn't known about before without having to go through full training courses or dig through all kinds of Google results until you find the specific context of what you're looking for. Constant availability. Maybe you have a question that you would normally default to asking one of your peers or a senior engineer on the team, but if you're working late one day and they've already signed off for the day, why not just punch it into ChatGPT and maybe you'll get some useful information there as well. And one of the biggest things is that it's customizable content that can be iterated to achieve a specific result. So let's say I'm looking on Stack Overflow or the inductive forums trying to find a specific answer. Maybe I find something that's very close but isn't quite what I need. I may not actually be able to find exactly what it is I need. But the beauty of something like ChatGPT is, say I give it, my first prompt, and it does the same thing. It returns something that's kind of close to what I want, but isn't exactly what I need. I can then give it additional context and error correction, and it will iterate on that answer and drive towards the correct information, which is not really something that you can do with a lot of other comparable, utilities. So flexible and compatible, free and easy to use. The free has an asterisk. There is a pro version now that has some additional availability benefits and things like that. But as of right now, the core functionality is still free. But on the flip side of this, it's also very important to consider when not to use this, or why you should not use it. But really, the question is when you shouldn't use it. When is it not the appropriate tool for what you're trying to do? So a couple of the things that we have here are, you do have to have some base knowledge of your intended output or what you're using it to try to find out. So, if I have never used Python before and I'm trying to get it to, out return some Python syntax that accomplishes a specific task, I would have no way of knowing how to validate that output result. Is this going to work correctly? Is it efficient at all? Is it, you have to have some kind of a base foundational knowledge to know whether or not what you get returned is something you can use. If you don't have that and you put this in production, you're going to have way more problems than if you had just figured out how to do it, completely manually on your own to begin with. Um, so the second point kind of describes that as well: response analysis, being able to know what you're trying to look for and to search for, so that you can validate your return results and make sure that it actually did give you what you were thinking. And so, as a tool versus a solution, this kind of comes back to the, is it going to replace our jobs? What is its function within our day to day? If you try to have something like ChatGPT be the end all be all of solving your problems, you're going to find that there's a lot of shortcomings. And that's really not where, especially in our line of work, it's going to actually benefit us the most. It's not intended to replace critical thinking, it's not intended to replace developing solutions. What its best use is as an efficiency tool. We already have solved the problem, we've already thought about what we need to do for the solution, and now this is going to help us reduce the amount of time it takes to get there. And then, as a last kind of more specific point, prompt quality. So within the same problem statement, if you give it a very generic prompt that doesn't use a lot of specific syntax for what field you're working in, you'll probably get some pretty low quality and at times totally erroneous answers. But you can build your prompts in such a way that you feed it a lot of detailed information and specific syntax that's tailored to the type of information you're looking for, and increase the quality of your prompt and increase the likelihood that you're going to get, if not the correct answer, at least a pretty good answer that could easily be iterated into the correct answer right off the bat. So it's not kind of a blind, just use it as it is solution. There has to be some kind of prerequisites in place. So going a little bit more into that, the limitations, lack of common sense and, more importantly, context, right? It does not know if the data it returned to you is correct for what you're trying to do. All it knows is that it found the relationships based off of all of the massive data sets it was trained on to return back associations based off of what you asked for. It does not know how to validate that that information was correct. It does have an inability to handle complex tasks without iteration. So the more difficult the problem statement we're trying to solve, the less likely we are to get a totally correct answer on the first go around. And you have to kind of know that going in. So the more straightforward the task and simple the utility, the more likely it is to be successful right off the bat. I already mentioned the syntax issues, and that also gets into some specific use cases. So if you're looking up syntax for something like ignition programming, it can do that, but it is also more likely to make a mistake than if you ask it for something like generic Python syntax that's much more widespread and has much more information out there in the model that it was trained on. So it is dependent on that model, on existing data. It can have bias depending on how some of the information was presented that it was trained on. And it is all this text-based chat utility, at least for the way that we're talking about this right now. And so there is an inability to work within certain platforms. So a couple of basic things going off of all of that that you need to know is that there is a definite difference between the frequency of correct first time answers versus correct answers after iteration. So it's depending on what type of information you're looking for, the success rate of correct first time answers is not always great, but with a few iterations and corrections, it nearly always will give you useful information for what you're looking for, at least from the type of things that I've used it in so far. There have been very few use cases where within a few corrections, I could not get to the intended useful output. Um, so there's a couple things you can do there. If it gives you a partial answer, you can tell it to continue and it will continue running along that same train of thought, if you will. You can provide specific errors. So let's say I asked it for a SQL syntax and then I ran it and I got an error. I can copy that error in and say, this is what happened. Could you modify the syntax? And it will correctly feed that back in. Or you can just provide a qualitative description of what you need to change, even if you don't have an exact error code. Um, I already mentioned foundational knowledge. If you're asking about Python syntax, you do have to have some kind of basic knowledge of how to use Python and what syntax is so that you know if what you're getting back is correct. And then again, most important generic concept for this entire presentation is what is the purpose of the tool and how is it being used? If you already know what you need to do, as far as tasks on a given day, and you find a way that this could make it more efficient but doesn't actually change the input and output of your work, that's the best case that we have for this. So now we'll kind of get into some specific examples kind of tailored to a lot of the things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So you can see some of the things that Addison and I have used it for, but this is only kind of, scratching the surface of potential applications. So start with, I'll let Addison get into some Python examples.
All right, so going into Python first here. So first example we have here is just a plain old how do I do X? So a lot of times ChatGPT can be a great starting point if you don't really know how to solve a specific problem. So in this example here, we just asked it, how do I access a value within a list of dictionaries? Like maybe I'm coming to Python from a different language and I don't understand Python dictionaries. I can ask ChatGPT, how do I do a specific thing? And you'll see it'll give me an example and then it'll explain after that example. It's a great way to discover new syntax, new concepts without really doing a tedious Google search. Um, and additionally, what you can do also is if you look over here to the right, you can ask it then questions and iterate on your previous prompts. So, for example, if I don't know what the brackets do, I can ask, what do the brackets do? And it'll give me an example or a summarization of what that does. Um, Although the caveat here is the prompts must be specific and you can't take this code at face value. If you are developing code and you ask ChatGPT to create code for you and you're taking that code and direct copying it into a production server without yourself understanding and knowing what that code does, that's a major red flag because while the code might look like it works and it might work right off the bat, if you don't understand what it's actually doing, it could be creating problems that you don't really know exist unless you understand what's going on. So again, ChatGPT can be used to understand and learn from the code as is seen here. Um, but that's just kind of the major caveat of using this is you do need to understand what you are doing before you can actually use it. Um, Next example up here. So probably one of the better use cases for this is a lot of our projects. If you're a developer, you know that you might get thrown onto a project that somebody has worked on in the past and might have created a function with no documentation. And you might be a new developer to Python. You don't really know what is going on. A great way to use this tool is to straight up copy and paste the function that's inside of the ignition library into here and just ask ChatGPT what this function does. 9 times out of 10, it's going to be able to tell you exactly what it does. It's going to be able to explain things. So in this example here, this is a really simple case of using Python list comprehension. And to somebody who's not familiar with Python, this might be something you just haven't seen before because it doesn't really pop up in languages that aren't Python. Um, so one of the best use cases of this is just copying and pasting. Obviously, you can go to Stack Overflow, W3 Schools, Google, but this gives you a more tailored and immediate response. And as we've seen before, you can also iterate on this and ask additional questions after the fact. Another great way to use this is to copy and paste your own code that you've already written into ChatGPT and ask it to improve that code. So the example that we have here is providing a nested loop to ChatGPT with an ON squared time complexity. And ChatGPT was easily able to recognize that as an inefficient function and to reduce that time complexity down to O of n. So if you are writing some really complicated, looping functions or dictionary accessing functions, this would be a great place to use that to see if there is some inefficiency in your code. And again, maybe the request or the response that it gives you, you just know is not going to work, but you might still be able to gain some value out of that anyways. And perhaps one of my favorite uses for this is documentation generation. So as programmers know, we all hate writing documentation. So one of the cool things that you can do is you can copy and paste in a function and tell it to write you a documentation code header for this. So this was an example that I did from one of the Westinghouse projects where I had a function and I was feeling lazy and didn't want to write the code header. So I just copied and pasted my function into ChatGPT and said, write me a code header for this. And it gave me the code header. It, told me what the function does, gave me all the inputs and outputs. The caveat here, again, is you have to know what your own code does and have to be able to proofread this correctly because you can't be 100% guaranteed that the documentation that it wrote for you is going to be correct. So definitely use it for that, but be aware it might give you incorrect answers. So always go back and proofread. Another really great use case for this is just common utilities function. So I know we do have a standard like ignition script library that a lot of different people have put together over the years that contain a lot of this like kind of standardized utility functions. But if there's something that you might need that doesn't exist in that library and you kind of think that this is something that should be really easy to do, but I don't really want to figure out how to do it, ChatGPT is great at that kind of thing. So the example here is just converting a JSON to an XML object. Very common task, especially within our MES applications. Something that, to be honest, is not really worth my time to figure out how to reinvent the wheel because this has been done, 100 different times, but maybe it's not exactly what you want. ChatGPT is great at this kind of thing of writing these kind of utility functions where it's not super important to make sure that it's exactly specific to your use case because it's a more general use. So anytime you run into this utility type thing, great use for ChatGPT.
So I'll go into some additional examples within the context of Ignition. So some of these basically are going to be Jython scripting that's similar to the kind of things Addison was just going over, but some of them will be a little bit more tailored. So one common thing throughout all of our MES applications is that there's a lot of kind of just boilerplate functions that we need in the code library. So in this example here, I need a set of time range functions. So on a reporting dashboard, I may have a bunch of selection criteria that lets the user pick from a preset list of time ranges to filter their production information to. So, today, yesterday, last week, this week, current year, last year, all those kind of basic time buckets and very easy functions to write. You can see how simple they are here. But if I just had to manually type them all out myself, that's extremely annoying and takes a little while. Whereas I can just tell ChatGPT what I need, what the syntax is, and what the exact list of parameters that it needs to execute that on is, and it returns all of this back in a matter of like 45 seconds. So at the end of the day, I didn't learn anything new with this kind of an example, but I did take a task that was otherwise going to take me, however many minutes and simplified it down to, nearly immediate just for returning all of this basic information that I can copy and put straight in my function library once I've given it a proofread and a test like I did over here to make sure that everything is returning correctly. So I applied it here with the sample, give me all of these time range functions, but this could be for any of these other very straightforward single use case kind of code generation things where we don't want to have to spend the time writing it ourselves because we already know what it needs to do. Next one is for those of you who are kind of getting more and more into the world of perspective development. There's a lot of really cool UI UX things you can do with modifying the theme file and modifying the style sheet resource that they pretty recently added, as well as just building things into style classes. So we can tailor our applications in a pretty detailed way if we make use of all of these features. And that's one of the things that, kind of keeps Vertech applications being world class, right? How many times do we get called out for how good our applications look? Like for the one that won the most recent Firebrand, that's one of the consistent themes. And so we want to be able to stay on top of that. And a lot of the times, maybe a project doesn't have a lot of extra budget for making something just look good. So the more quickly we're able to make these kind of development changes, the better. So in this case, I actually gave it a totally, qualitative prompt. I said, "There's this object, and I want it to look like this. I want the borders to use this color, and I want them to have a certain width that corresponds to the size of the browser. But maybe I don't know much about CSS syntax, so I don't know how to program that myself." Well, rather than, trying to learn all of that on the fly, I just give it this prompt and it tells me what the basic syntax is. And the beauty of this is that this would be extremely, yeah, that is a good point. I think this is from a previous slide actually, but the headers of the code snippet languages are almost always wrong. It's really funny because it returns everything in Python syntax, and sometimes it just tells you it was a different language. But anyways, to get back to this, so this can be immediately tested, right? I could copy this into the style sheet resource in a new project and immediately see if the visuals of my session changed the way I wanted them to. And if they didn't, I can iterate on this prompt and immediately get at the next round of syntax that I would need. And it's a very easy way to learn some of these things that maybe I didn't know before. And it even does call out dependencies. So like here, I mentioned that I needed this variable. So it said, hey, by the way, you need to make sure that you've actually defined that variable in the root and that it looks something like this. I also iterated on here, like maybe I didn't know what some of these variables were that were in the return syntax. So if I didn't know what viewport width and viewport height meant in this context, I can ask it. It'll explain what those are and give me additional information that way. Um, this one is starting to get onto the border of complex tasks that can be difficult to automate within a single prompt. But here we're using it to generate unit testing functions based on functions that we just wrote. And so what we did here was just ask it for a simple script that calls a REST API, and then we asked it to use that code and write automated test cases against it. And so will this give us a 100% accurate situation for how we need to test our code within the scope of an MES application? Probably not. But will it give us a great starting point for the syntax of how to write these test cases, make it very easy to start copy pasting and expanding this stuff as we go? Certainly. And as you all are aware, there are very few projects that have enough budget to do the level of automated testing and due diligence that some of the size of software applications that we develop really warrant. And so anything that can get us that increased efficiency in these kind of areas is definitely something we want to look into. So we asked it for the syntax using the unit test library. It returned back some sample functions and what statements or conditions it's going to check for. And then we also said, use that code and give us the syntax for how you would actually run it and what kind of return value you would expect out of that. And so again, all of this can be a great starting point, especially if this is something that you haven't worked with before. Now, you always have to keep all the concepts we've been harping on in mind, right? So if I wanted to use this in Ignition, on the left over here, it's using the requests library and it's using Python 3 print syntax. So I would need to keep that in mind to ask it to tailor it to those specific changes if this was something I was actually trying to do within the scope of one of our projects. Another one, this is similar on the generic Python functions, but just common utilities that we need in a lot of projects. In this case, I know I needed a regex expression to validate some input field on one of our form applications, but I didn't feel like going and giving myself the refresher on regex syntax in Python to figure out how to have that work correctly. So I just told ChatGPT, what would be the syntax be to perform these checks, and it returns the value. So again, tasks that otherwise would take a few minutes of searching and confirming and relearning different things are now reduced to seconds. This one, I am showing that you can actually tailor it to specific use cases. For example, Ignition API calls. So here, I said not only give me the Python code, I said using inductive automation's Ignition implementation of Jython 2.7 and the Ignition system library, give me a function that runs this REST API and returns all the breweries in Nashville. And so I gave it some specific pointers about how the Jython syntax should be used to generate the string and print out the result list so that it doesn't get confused and start mixing in Python 3 concepts there. And this is a really simple function, but the thing to highlight is that it did work and it did use the ignition syntax. So it can access, pretty specific use cases beyond just what you would maybe think right off the bat of what it can do. Now, should you copy this as it is and use it in your code? No. If you notice that it uses system.net.http get, which is not the recommended function anymore, there's an updated version of that function. So you do have to give it the sanity check. But even within the environments that we're working in, it can still work as this accelerator for getting to the starting point of accomplishing specific tasks, even within something like Ignition. Now, this one I have an asterisk on because it demonstrates one of the purposes that we've been kind of talking about a little bit, where specific syntax often requires iteration. So here I just asked it to give me the code for a simple task like reading a dataset tag, filtering it, and then writing it back to the tag. And it does access the system.tag functions for Ignition correctly, but then it tries to apply a method on the return value that doesn't exist. And so I had to give it an additional prompt and say, Ignition datasets don't have that method. Can you provide the same functionality using these functions? And then it corrected everything. And so this is just showing that even with having to provide these kind of iterations and small corrections, I was still able to generate something oftentimes more quickly than I otherwise would have been able to if I had to have the docs open and was writing all of these functions by hand myself. So next we'll go through a couple of examples that have to do with SQL and database record keeping. So one that Addison and I have both used this quite a bit for is just schema generation. So when we're at the design phase of a project and I kind of know what a specific database schema needs to do, what kind of objects it needs to have, I just don't want to sit there taking the time actually writing the syntax to generate all of those objects. Now, are there other utilities that can help this kind of a process out there? Sure. But one thing that's really nice about using ChatGPT for this kind of a task is that I can give it and I'll get to this slide in a moment, I can tailor the prompt to a pretty extreme level of detail where I'm actually telling it what I want all of my naming constraints to be, what the relationships between tables need to be, how it needs to process certain data types, that kind of thing, to the point where in a simple world, I can qualitatively describe the schema that I want, or maybe I have, kind of I'll call it a wireframe of the schema just in an Excel document. I can literally copy paste all of those columns into the end of my prompt, and it will process all of them and turn them into the SQL syntax to actually generate the schema. And it works when you give it a specific prompt, it works with a pretty good degree of accuracy here. Now, sometimes you run into some text limitations and you have to tell it to continue a couple of times so that it keeps processing through and finishes your request. But in the examples that we've given it here, I just gave it a qualitative prompt to say, I want this gem tracking schema that does X, Y, and Z. Give me the syntax. I've actually used it on another project that was tracking, hourly employee clock-ins and placing them on an attendance board where I can assign them to specific roles. I gave it the initial information about that schema, and it actually returned back all of the syntax and saved me, a couple of hours of having to type through and check all of that. As a kind of a side note and plug about efficiency throughout your day, now that we generated our SQL syntax to generate the schema nearly immediately, wouldn't it also be nice if we could immediately generate our documentation and keep that up to date all at the same time? So in this case, I used a different program called DB Schema, and not to associate that with ChatGPT, but just to say, the mindset that we all need to start kind of shifting to is if I find myself spending more than 5 minutes of my day doing any one thing, it's worth just running the question by myself of, am I doing this the right way? Is there a better way to do this? Is there a faster way to do this? We don't want to get caught in the classic operator kind of thought process of, well, it's always been done this way, therefore I have to do it this way. We want to be the opposite, right? If there's a way to do it better, innovation is one of our pillars, right? So I've used this a lot to keep both the SQL scripts and the actual PDF documentation packages in sync in real time with pretty much no added effort. And this is what I was mentioning about the more detail you give the prompt, the more correct your first answer will be. So here, I told it I want Microsoft SQL Server syntax. I gave it the schema name. I gave it the naming convention for primary keys. I gave it the naming convention for foreign keys. I told it, what size certain data types should be. I told it that all tables need to have certain columns with certain default constraints, and it will apply that everywhere with very, very good accuracy. And so it just, again, extreme time saver of I now don't need to go through and put all of that in myself. It's just going to give it to me the first time around. The next example we have is actually modifying an existing query. So maybe we're working in an agile environment, or we're developing phase 2 of a project, whatever the case may be, and we have some base functionality that we now need to add some additional detail to. And if it's a reasonably complicated query, it might be kind of difficult to figure out exactly what needs to change and still keep it efficient. To get that kind of starting point of, where should I look, what do I need to change? You can paste the query into ChatGPT, give it the descriptive prompt of what you're trying to add, what you're trying to change, and it can give you options of what you can do to accommodate those goals. So in this case, we just had a query that was pulling routing information for a track and trace project, and told it that we need to modify it so that it returns specific data on a given criteria, and it gave us a sample syntax of how to do that. Now, you still do need to validate this, one, that it works, and two, by checking the query plan to make sure that this is an efficient response, but it's still good as a starting point to figure out how to do something. And our next example is troubleshooting a complex query, or really also identifying new concepts. So let's say there's a developer who's pretty new to databases and to SQL syntax. They, for example, might not have used common table expressions before, but that type of syntax is needed for a lot of cases where you need recursive lookup behaviors. And so in this case, I gave it this table of cities with the distances in between them, assuming that this is all just, one-way train tracks basically, and told it to give me all the possible permutations of routes between certain cities and what that total distance would be. Because, maybe it would have, if I'd never worked with this before, how long would it have taken me, fumbling on my own or looking through Google and Stack Overflow to figure out what that proper syntax is to accomplish the goal of that query. Whereas now it gave me an answer that in this case was actually correct, but even if it was not totally correct, if it got me 90% of the way there, I could pretty easily figure out what was wrong or what needed to change about it to get to the end result. And it also explains how the query works. So it doesn't just give you the blind syntax, it tells you what it's doing in each part of it. And if there was a specific part that I wanted to know more about, for example, if I didn't know what common table expressions were at all, I could say, what are those? Or could you link me to an article describing what they are and how to use them? And it will kind of give that additional filler information. And this was all, extremely tailored. I didn't have to do any digging on any kind of other knowledge base or docs or anything like that. Some other brief examples. These are not as common with what we do in the general day-to-day, but just to show that there's so many wide ranges of places that you can use this tool. We have some for OS and containers. So let's say I'm working in Docker and I'm not familiar with Docker syntax, and I say I want to run the latest ignition container and change some of the ports. What does the syntax do that? I can request that it gives me those Docker commands and include details about what syntax I want to change, and it will give me that starting code to run to actually accomplish that. Maybe it doesn't do everything I needed right off the bat, but if I don't know anything about the syntax I'm looking for, this can help give me a useful first example that I can then compare against the Docker documentation and pretty easily see, oh, okay, well now I just need to add this one other thing, and maybe shortening something that would have taken 15 minutes into taking 5 minutes. That's the goal of all of this. We'll keep saying that over and over again, but right, that's the goal, is to make things more efficient and to be, the best developer that you can by being able to accomplish things extremely efficiently. Other one, let's say you've got a project where you've got to work only in Linux environments and you've been a Windows person, always and forever. and you don't know much about Linux syntax, you could ask it how you do certain things. In this case, just a really basic example of how to install a new package. And then you could follow up with questions like, what is, sudo, and why does the update process have to run first? And it could give you some of that new background information without having to dig through all of the Linux documentation or go through a full, tutorial or training session where you learn everything. You just kind of, might need to know only a few simple things to start with.
All right. So a lot of the CSIs on this call might be asking the question, does ChatGPT understand how to do PLCs? So yes and no. So I've linked a really great video here that if you are a CSI, I would highly recommend giving a watch after this presentation. So ChatGPT, while it can't do like straight ladder logic PLC programming, it does have an awareness of a lot of the structured text languages that are used by Siemens or Allen Bradley or other of the PLC manufacturers out there. It also does have the ability to understand and recognize the different types of controllers and device types. And it does have the ability to help you troubleshoot those. So if you are getting like an error on a device connection, you could ask ChatGPT, I'm getting this error code. What does this mean? It knows a lot of that stuff. However, you do have to keep in mind that the training data for ChatGPT only goes up to 2021. So some of the newer stuff is not in there. But if you are a CSI, highly recommend taking a look at this video. It goes into real depth of what you can and cannot use ChatGPT for when dealing with PLCs specifically. All right, so if you're on this call and you're not on the engineering team, you might be wondering, what can I use ChatGPT for that does not have to deal with Python or SQL or Ignition or any of these things? Oh, or Andrew's desktop. Um, so there are a couple of great examples, use cases here where you can use this that has nothing to do with engineering whatsoever. One of my favorite things to do is to summarize meeting transcripts. So if you've noticed Microsoft Teams, when you finish a meeting that has been recorded, it gives you this nice handy transcript of the meeting. You can straight up copy and paste that entire transcript into ChatGPT and it'll summarize that meeting. So for example, here I copied and pasted the engineering teams meeting from about a month back into ChatGPT and told it to summarize the meeting. The one caveat here is if you only have the free version, there's a text limit of how much you can copy and paste into the model. But if you do have the premium version, I've heard that you can have it recognize up to an entire like 400-page book worth of text. So if you're looking for it to have to like write a book report for you or something, I guess that's something that it can do. For the premium version, that is. Some other general use cases for it. Writing a sales email. So if you are on the sales team and you might have a new client, you don't know how to interact with that client or just are feeling lazy, you can tell it to write a sales email for you. Here, I just told it I've got a solar client. Write me a sales email, cold calling them basically, and it'll do stuff like that for you in a pretty human-like manner. Now, I will also preface this with, since ChatGPT came out, there are now a number of AI or ChatGPT like identifiers that exist out on the internet. So you can take text, copy it, and paste it into this identifier, and it'll tell you the likelihood of that text being generated by an AI. So you don't really want to use this for something that's really important. A great example of improper use of this was actually, I think it was Vanderbilt University sent out an email following one of the shootings at Michigan State a couple months ago, and they used ChatGPT to write an email, which is kind of in very poor taste. So just be careful of what you're using this for. Obviously, you don't want to come across as not caring by just telling an AI to write something for you. Um, a LinkedIn summary is another great way if you're looking to, beef up your LinkedIn profile. You can tell it your experience, give it specific skills that you have, and it'll go ahead and it'll write a very specific, summary of your skills for LinkedIn. And Perhaps my favorite use of ChatGPT is writing poetry. So it knows all forms of poetry. So if I tell it to come and write a poem about a man named Titus who started an engineering controls company called Vertech that focuses on elevating human well-being through automation, it'll write me a poem. So yeah, again, this can be used for pretty much anything that you can think of regarding text. Um, so feel free to obviously hop on. It's completely free as of right now. Who knows how long that will last? So try it out now and see what you can come up with. And I think that's everything. So unless Andrew has anything else, I think we'll open it up to questions.
If you find any novel or super useful use cases for it, by all means, those are the kind of things to share with your teams because chances are you're solving a problem that somebody else is also encountering in real time. So, um, if Vertex's going to stay at the top, we've all got to continuously get better and make sure that when one person overcomes a problem, everyone else on the team, benefits from that experience.